Welcome to the GEMMS virtual lecture for today by Professor Ann Hughes. We'll probably wait just a couple more minutes to see if anyone else is arriving. And then I'll do a bit of an introduction and pass things over to Anne. So we'll just wait a couple of minutes to start. And we have a hello from France. I imagine some then from, we're mostly based in Canada, and Hughes, of course, is in England. And from the Netherlands as well. And Ireland, Morocco, and south of France, yes. So we're definitely international today. Apparently, many French listeners are preparing a competitive exam and needing information about Puritanism. So you're in a good place.
Yeah,
well, why don't we, okay, something's still in the waiting room. Why don't we start, get going today? My name is Jennifer Farouk. I'm the research associate for GEMMS. And in case you don't know, GEMMS is the gateway to early modern manuscript sermons. We have created a bibliographic database of manuscript sermons, early modern manuscript sermons from 1530 to 1715. The database includes records for a variety of types of sermon manuscripts, including not only complete sermons, but also sermon notes, which Ann Hughes is going to be talking about today, and sermon reports, a whole variety of things. Currently, there's over 25,000 sermons in the database from more than 80 repositories, libraries, and archives, primarily in the UK and in North America. Oh, someone said there's having problems with sound. Is anybody else having issues hearing us? Okay. Seems mostly okay. If you're having trouble with sound, maybe try logging out and coming back in. There might be just some sort of technical glitch, because it seems like most people can hear us. Okay. So that's GEMMS. Please check out the database, which you'll find links in all the emails you've gotten from us. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Professor Ann Hughes. She is a Professor Emerita of Early Modern History at Keele University. She has published 5 monographs on religion and politics in the mid-17th century from England, especially focusing on things to do with the English Revolution. And she's published quite a number of works that have related to hearers, readers, and preachers of sermons. She is currently co-editing the Oxford History of Puritanism with Dr. Francis Bremer and Dr. Greg Salazar. She's also working on a book focusing on the religious manuscripts and public activism of Walter Boothby, who she'll be talking about today. So I'm assuming she's drawing on this research for her lecture today. And I'll pass things over to you. Oh, and we'll do her lecture, and then we'll have time for some questions at the end. Thank you. And I'll pass things over to you.
To me, to Anne. Yeah,
yes.
I should say I can't see
Ann
anybody.
Hughes.
Yeah, I can't see anybody if I can see my PowerPoint. So you can look as bored as you like, and I won't know. But it does mean you'll have to shout at me rather than waving at me if you want me to stop or do anything. It's a very great privilege to be giving this lecture. GEMMS is a fantastic resource for people like me who are interested in preaching and how people listen to and made records of preaching. And also I'm also interested in the godly clergy, Presbyterian clergy in particular. So it's fantastic. I'm going to be talking today about two London merchants, Walter Boothby, the one I'm writing a book on one day, I hope, and an almost exact contemporary of Walter Boothby's, a man called John Harper. They're both they're born probably about the same time, both born about 1600, both die in the 1660s, both I'd have thought broadly Calvinist, you know, serious men, both a part of their lives members of the London Corporation. But I hope to show that actually within what's that broad framework, there are some differences between them, and I'll come back to that at the end. Two men, three very interesting, I think, religious manuscripts, mainly concerned with sermon notes. I'm going to talk particularly, I think, about the form of the notes or the form of the records, reports of the sermons, but also try and give you a flavour of the actual content. So I just hope it won't be too sort of pedantically technical, and you can ask me about other things in the end. I'm going to start and finish with the Restoration. During the period 1659 to 1662, which were very tumultuous and many ways traumatic years for a man like Walter Boothby, who was a serious Presbyterian, a period when their hopes were first raised and then dashed, a period where both these men, busy men, amongst all the other things they were doing, which I'll come on to, they were taking sermon notes. And I just start the first slide, which I hope you can see, is a passage from a massive notebook that I'll talk at length about by Walter Boothby, a record of a sermon by Edmund Calamy early in 1660, when Calamy and Boothby will have been relatively cheerful. That for some points of view, and me myself in certain moods, I'd be really interested in Edmund Calamy in early 1660, producing, you know, a very timely sermon. I just want to say at the beginning, it appears in this notebook as part of a long passage about the advantages and power of prayer. And what I think is interesting, and just as a way of thinking about from the lay organization of the book, the sort of timeliness is slightly effaced by being put into a long series of passages on the value of prayer. And I've here done the opposite of what Boothby did and sort of used it to illustrate early 1660. Presbyterians thought that the power of prayer could be demonstrated by the defeat of the radicals in the army, who'd broken up the restored rump in 1659, and in their terms were attacking magistracy and ministry, and that this their defeat was a deliverance, as in Souchon, a subduing of their enemies. But it also hints at the tensions and problems of the Restoration, but nonetheless, they didn't know what the issue here was. For unless we amend our ways and our doings, we may be carried back to Egypt again. I can pick out at the start of this lecture the timeliness of that sermon, but I think it's interesting. It appears in a different context in the manuscript I'll spend a lot of time thinking about in this lecture. But I want to talk about the men, first of all, the compilers of these manuscripts. I just want to say, you know, my emphasis throughout this is on the men who compiled the manuscripts rather than on the preachers. So I'm trying to get the next slide. Don't say it won't move. Yep. So the first man I'm talking about is John Harper. Calls himself in his notebook, which is in the Clark Library in Los Angeles, calls himself Junior when he's making his notes until his father died. He's a fishmonger, he's a warden of the fishmongers in 1654. He was offered to be an alderman in 1650 when they were desperate for aldermen after the regicide. He refused to serve, but he was the common councillor of his ward from 1658 till he died in 1667. From a leading family in a small and unremarkable London parish of Margaret Moses, and he's church warden of that parish in 1637. All his life, he made notes on the sermons that he'd attended, and at some point, probably I think between 1656 and 1657, he created a further fair copy of his notes, or some of them, because of course we don't know how many notes he made, in a volume of almost 600 pages. He was close to the parish. He and his father were both close to the parish minister of the 1620s and 1630s, the moderate Puritan Richard Culverwell. He was clearly interested in preaching, a godly man, but there's no sign with Harper of any particular parliamentarian zeal. He described St. Paul's as a cathedral throughout the 1640s and 1650s, and was reluctant to serve the parliamentarian regime until very late in his life, from 1658. His volume covers the 1620s to the 1660s, but it was clearly not written sequentially. It begins with the slide shows notes on Culverwell's series of sermons on the Lord's Prayer and the sacraments, followed by notes on 16 occasional sermons, mostly on public occasions, beginning with Culverwell on the protestation and continuing till February 1657. One of these was recorded from memory in October 1656. So there was presumably safe space left in his book at this time. You'll see I'm obsessed with how they managed to actually create the notebooks that come down to us. Then there was Culverwell's sermons on the Creed, after what was presumably after he copied out, which were done in the 1620s, copied out after the occasional sermons. And then Culverwell's successor and who was also his son-in-law, sermons upon several heads of divinity preached by Benjamin Needler, who was the minister of St. Margaret Moses in the 1640s and 1650s. 32 sermons on several heads of divinity, and then Needler's farewell sermon as a Presbyterian after in 1662. But then that he had notes on Needler's successor, Charles Burke, much rougher notes of an unidentified sermon, and then 35 unnumbered pages written from the back, with briefer notes on 18 sermons, the morning lecture in Margaret Moses, and 12 fast days, Thanksgiving days, particularly over the Restoration. This then is a complex volume, depending on for its construction on prior notebooks. There must have been other records of all these sermons that he then copied into this notebook that survived. They must have been copied I think they're based very often, must have been, because many of them are what I think we might call long records, long witnesses, copied in longhand at least once, and perhaps more than once. In my published one, I published an article on the Culverwell sermons in 1620s and early 1630s. And I've suggested that he began to write out the Richard Culverwell sermons, notes from sermons, perhaps after listening to the Needless sermons, which were similarly on the fundamentals of the faith, but were in the more troubled 1650s, more sense of division, particularly theological division, and certainly, of course, ecclesiological division about the basics of Christian religion. But one advantage of John Harper as a lay sermon note taker is he explains how he does it, or he tells you how the notes have been constructed. So his methods seem to vary. Only two of them, including a 1656 fast day sermon and also a much later restoration sermon, only two of them does he say, "This I set down as my memory served me when I came home," and they consist only of a paragraph. Most of the occasional sermons, as with the 1648 example, are written these three sermons from my notebook, which I took from the mouths of them when they preached them, and variations on that sort of phrase, which I do take to be a shorthand note. This Culverwell sermons, the top example, suggests perhaps something rather different. Gathered these notes from Mr. Richard Culverwell, our minister's sermons, which he then preached, etc. The Culverwell sermons are particularly long accounts, and he may well have had access to the preacher's manuscripts, as well as, or instead of, shorthand notes. I think also, as we know from lots of sources, lay note takers may well have compared notes, shared notes, and so on, the sermons that they had indeed. But what I want to say is complex ways in which this book was created, where it was worked over, but dependent on prior manuscripts, and worked over to write lists and tables of the sermons. So they're depend on prior records, they're worked on over a long time. And sometimes if we just think of them as notes of isolated sermons, we miss the sort of nuances and complexity of what lay people were doing. And very long witnesses of sermons are characteristic also of the two surviving manuscripts, my second, and as we heard at the beginning, one of my main focuses in my research at the moment, of Walter Boothby. Say, born in 1600, dies in 1669, same sort of period as Harper. And I'm going to start with him as well, with a restoration, a volume restoration, focused on the restoration. But he was the fifth son of a prosperous Elizabethan and Stuart merchant, a merchant adventurer himself, who was an active common councilman in London, 1642 and 1649, and a member of Parliament's controversial accounts committee over some of the same period. That accounts committee was largely what we usually call Presbyterian politicians, well, Presbyterian merchants and other people. He was a customs commissioner along with other Presbyterian sympathisers in the mid-late 1640s. And he was an active campaigner with his particularly with his father-in-law, George Witham in the city campaigns of the 1640s to establish an effective Presbyterian ecclesiastical system. He was implicated in the disastrous attempt to get Presbyterian control of the city militia in the summer of 1647, a disastrous move that prompted the occupation of London by the New Model. And typically for this sort of man, although he was re-elected to the Common Council in the autumn of 1648, he was purged after the regicide. Nonetheless, he acquired church lands confiscated from the bishopric of Durham in the 1650s. He surfaced briefly during the Second Protectorate Parliament as his better-known kinsman and fellow Customs Commissioner from the 1640s, Sir Christopher Pack, tried to sort out the costly mess customs accounts had been left in 1649. Above all else, though, in the 1630s and early 1650s, he was an active member of perhaps the most famous Puritan parish in London, the famous godly parish of Mary Aldermanbury. And he was nominated from that parish as a ruling elder in the London Provincial Assembly. He was churchwarden, overseer of the poor, auditor of churchwardens' accounts, and so on in that parish, and certainly until the early 1650s. And many of the sermons contained in the second book I'll talk about were by the successive famous godly ministers of St Mary Aldermanbury Parish. Thomas Taylor died in 1632, John Stoughton, who took over, and then Edmund Calamy, one of the great Presbyterian ministers of the Civil War period. But I want to start with the second book, if you like, of Walter Boothby, which is a book clearly constructed in the Restoration years, although including some other very interesting sermons as well. After was thrown out of the Common Council, Boothby lived more often in Tottenham than in Aldermanbury. But events from the autumn of 1659 seem to have prompted a return to the city and perhaps to some public activity. Boothby, as well as a merchant adventurer, was a member of the Haberdashers' Company. Never very prominent in it, but he was chosen as master of the company in November 1660, which obviously meant that he was often in London. May not have enjoyed a great feast that was held at Haberdashers' Hall same month, November 1660, when he became master, which was held apparently to celebrate the consecration of 7 bishops. He had a son-in-law, John Jolliffe, who was a Presbyterian member of the Convention Parliament. So he's a very busy man and very involved man in 1660-62. But amongst all his other affairs, what we can be certain of is that Boothby was attending sermons. He told an errant son of his in the 1650s that when he urged his son Thomas to be a conscientious hearer of the word, he said he'd been a conscientious hearer himself since his youth. This, he said, I did in the cold winter mornings and went to lecture while I was as young as you are. Go and do likewise. I have to say his son didn't go and do likewise, but Boothby did his best. In particular, though, Thomas Boothby was back in the familiar pulpit of Mary Aldermanbury, hearing the increasingly sombre sermons of Edmund Calamy, who he'd heard for some 20 years. And Walter Boothby was taking very detailed notes of these sermons, almost certainly shorthand notes, perhaps like Harper aided or augmented by some access to preachers' outlines or the notes of fellow hearers. Using the shorthand or perhaps copying from an already written out longhand transcription, these sermons were written out again for the second or perhaps the third time in a neat quarto volume, running in the end to some 750 quarto pages, and held in the Congregational Library. Not clear where now, with the closure of Dr. Williams at the Congregational Library, is where that might be, but I'm sure it's safe somewhere. It's called It's Cordial in Her Fainting Fits. And it begins, say, with sermons by Calamy, but also by other, April and May 1661, also by other famous Presbyterians, St. Simeon Ash, who was Calamy's assistant at this point, William Jenkins, Thomas Watson. But in the summer of 1661, I think, because there's a gap between April and September, he began to insert equally long accounts of other sermons, presumably reminded perhaps of memories of other sermons he had records of, particularly as Calamy began to preach rather gloomy sermons on Jeremiah and other gloomy texts in the autumn of 1661. Not in the order, but he included sermons from 1642, 1647, and 1648 and 1653. Now, these inserted sermons, with the exception of Stephen Marshall's sermon from the months before, the exciting months for someone like Boothby, I think, just in the months before the Civil War broke out. July 1647, November 1648, and the summer and autumn of 1653 were, without exception, from periods where things were going badly for the Presbyterians. And the Calamy sermon, for instance, on the 28th of July, the record of that sermon is again very important for people who are interested in the climactic events when the Presbyterians were trying. It's preached on the fast day as the New Model Army is approaching London to bring to heel the Presbyterians, lay and perhaps urged on by ministers who are trying to raise the London militia as a counter to what they see as a sectarian New Model Army. There's no other record, there's no printed version, there's no other, as far as I know, long version of that sermon. So 1647, not a good time for Walter Boothby or Edmund Calamy. November 1648, radical enthusiasm brewing the execution of the king and for securing religious toleration. 1653, bare bones assault in Calamy and Boothby's sense on the learned maintained ministry. So I think these sermons are, say, mostly from bad periods, yet the volume is called The Church is Cordial in Her Fainting Fits. And very simply, I think one of the things Boothby's doing here was remembering earlier times in his life when things were going badly for Presbyterians, yet they'd lived to fight another day. And he's also perhaps locating the developments of previous, lent on my computer there. He's locating the developments of the previous 20 years within multiple time frames, from the vagaries of his own public life to the sacred chronology of God's unfolding promises for his chosen people. So I think we could list the sermons very simply that he records, but it's clearly a complex volume. And it clearly, and I imagine him in, I don't know, some sort of cluttered office or library, manuscript library. It depends on several prior manuscripts now lost, but manuscripts that presumably for Boothby were organised in some way that he could locate them and reuse them. Boothby doesn't explain his methods in the way Harper does, but we can deduce from the order, and for instance, the Stephen Marshall sermon from 1642 looks as if he's left space for it, but not quite enough, because the last couple of pages are written out right at the end of the volume. And I think, I suppose the main point is the complexity and the fact that many of the wonderful manuscripts link GEMMS has made us aware of. If we're just interested in Calamy's sermon in July 1647, which is fantastically interesting to have a record of that sermon, then we could just go and use it. But if we're interested in what Boothby's notebooks are, how Boothby's notebooks came to be in existence, then they're complex, they're done at different times, the relationship to this when the sermons were preached, they depend on other manuscripts, all sorts of complexities emerge, many of which of course we can't be sure of the answers to, but I think they are worth thinking about. And I want to come now then to what someone asked me last week. I said this is one of the most extraordinary manuscripts, religious manuscripts kept by a lay person in the mid-17th century. And she asked me where that, whose opinion that was. I said mine. She then said, where did you write that? I said, well, no, I just tell people this. It's not, I don't have a printed reference to justify it. I will stand by it. This is called it's called a nosegay. Again, and I'll come back on to the titles. Boothby called it a nosegay of everlasting orificial flowers gathered out of heaven's paradise. It's Bodleian Library manuscript, and it's a big manuscript. That's, I want to tell you how hard I've worked on it, and GEMMS has worked very hard on it too. It's a manuscript by a man who loves writing, who writes over the paste downs, the inside covers. He writes on the vellum, the vices of rulers, right on the vellum, the vices of rulers are rulers of vice. He writes on the fold down of that, a rebellious son is to be stoned by God's law, and bow the knee to God and Christ to burn forth your king. So he's a note taker and a note taker of notes, he loves to write. It's clearly, again, I don't think we'll ever know how many sermons, along with books and perhaps his own experiences, but books, but mostly sermons, went into this volume. It overall has 750 folio pages of religious material, bigger than the substantial Congregational Library volume, plus 150 pages of letters from 1641 to 1663, that they're a good Oxford DPhil thesis by someone who's worked on GEMMS. I think Lucy Busfield used it for a DPhil on epistolary epistolary culture and Puritanism and religion. It again depends on loads of previous manuscripts, and indeed there are some cross references in in the manuscript itself. The index calls this Walter Boothby his book number 2. And amongst some of the sermons, relatively rare, but one sermon from 1634 that's given a note of 1634, he says, "You shall find this in my 6th book." In the 1630 sermons, he mentions book 6, 7, 8, and 9. Then he mentions books 19 and 20. And in a 1650 sermon, there's a reference to book 30. So there may be that he made had access to notes, made shorthand notes, books, and transferred them to other books, and ended up with a survivor of this book. Perhaps in time, GEMMS will find other Walter Boothby manuscripts, and I'll have to pretend that I'm very grateful. I just want to mention again that I want to consider these as lay manuscripts. The online catalogue of the Congregational Library lists Boothby's first manuscript as under things like sermons by Callamy, Ash, Watson, Marshall, etc. So the fuller manuscript catalogue identifies Boothby. And as Meredith Neumann, whose work on sermon notes I very much admire, she does, she points out that catalogues, and perhaps even GEMMS, I don't know, that probably isn't fair, but certainly library catalogues often privilege the preacher who spoke rather than the hearer who heard and then wrote. Now, I don't want to be precious about and say these volumes are simply lay volume and that aren't useful for the preachers. Of course, they're useful for understanding the messages and methods of Callamy, Needler, Richard Culverwell, Thomas Watson, whoever. And indeed, a while ago, I published an article which was about Richard Culverwell more than it was about John Harper. But I think it is worthwhile exploring these manuscripts as lay volumes. These men were busy men, particularly Boothby, yet he and indeed Harper spent enormous amount of time into religious writing. Perhaps not what we would call composition or authorship, but it's not simply passive copying. They were selecting, abbreviating, cutting up, and juxtapositioning in different ways. And I want to insist that these are originally, in the form they come down to us, Boothby's and Harper's notebooks, representing, demonstrating, reinforcing their outlook and commitments. Many substantial sermon manuscripts, including those I think in GEMMS, were composed by, and if we're thinking about lay manuscripts, not preachers' notes, were composed by anonymous or ill-documented people. And both Harper and Boothby, especially Boothby, are in contrast hearers and recorders we can know something about. And I think it actually helps in understanding or identifying the preachers too. We know, for instance, that Dr. Taylor, cannot be Jeremy Taylor, although, literary scholars might prefer it to be, because we know that Boothby is making his sermon notes, the late 1620s, early 1630s, in St Mary Aldermanbury, where Taylor was a well-known preacher. Most of the Bodleian volume, as I've said, indeed, are by successive preachers in Mary Aldermanbury, beginning with Thomas Taylor and continuing with Thomas. Now, if I think about what this book is like, I used to agree with John Spur that it was in the process of mutating into a commonplace book. I've put that in print. And I think we've both got it the wrong way round, that what it is precisely the opposite. It's rather a failed commonplace book, or like many of these manuscripts, it's complicated. It began as, or was intended as a sort of commonplace book. And of course, you know, the orificial flowers has some echoes of the florigellium, you know, the sort of gathering of extracts. And the headings on this notebook, very variable, but they were initially written. The notebook began by being divided into 10-page intervals with headed of Christ, of prayer, and so on. But Boothby's categories, like in lots of commonplace books, soon broke down. They were either too broad. One of his favourite headings was Signs of Saving Grace and Salvation, which cover at least 100 of these 750 pages. So they're too broad at the headings. Or they could mean, or they merge into other categories. He gets fear and affliction get tangled up together, because obviously you're often frightened of affliction, and if you're afflicted, you often get to be afraid. Or they spawned ever more complex subcategories, so that prayer might become prayer, or it might become praying in an unknown tongue. I think there are at least 160 sermons. Sometimes they're a series of sermons, and we could have a very technical discussion, you know, with GEMMS researchers as to where, you know, how many precisely of, you know, Calamy's sermons on saving grace and salvation there are. They mostly, as I say, in successive ministers, Mary Aldermanbury, Calamy's assistants, Simeon Ash and Matthew Newcomb, including them. There's quite a few from a young William Bates, who was briefly a minister at Tottenham. In the 1630s, there are a range of Puritan ministers, including some who had very different careers, Henry from the mainstream, such as John Danforth or Henry Burton. There are some extracts from books, many I think not yet, well, I haven't identified them all, I think, including some rather demanding compendiums, possibly Calvin's commentaries, Ursinus, and so on. Printed sermons, occasionally sermons of John Preston can be identified. Occasionally comments, scripturally based reflections of Boothby's own, but those are rare. Mostly they're notes from sermons. And the structures and techniques of these sermons vary, which suggests perhaps he's trying to represent them as preached, but there may be some flattening out as he put them into a structure of his own devising. There's no certain examples, I think, here of a sermon that survives also in print. There are one or two where I've found other lay sermon notes of the same sermon, and they're always recognizable, they're always different. And there's some, you know, there's a volume in Sheffield archives that through GEMMS I've discovered that also has some sermons that must be similar, if not the same, on the hypocrisy that Boothby probably heard. Boothby liked long lists, but so of course did Calamy in his printed sermon. So you can't always be sure whether it's a lay person structure or the preacher's structure. But of course, the distinction is not clear cut, that their sermons were structured to establish a symbiotic list between hearers and note takers. Anyway, I'm just going to catch up with my slides. Just here, there's a sort of rare example of what looks like a sort of, you know, a successful commonplace book, definition of saving graces from a series of sermons, but also from starting with a definition taken from a serious book for a layman to read, a definition of the Lord's Supper from Ursinus. But mostly, as I've already said, I think I've got behind my, no, I've got ahead of my note of my things. This is through the table at the beginning. And again, I think the table index at the beginning is important. It shows how this is worked on over a great deal of time, of prayer, why God delays in hearing prayer. And then it becomes an alphabetical list because he has motives unto patience, then what wrestling by prayer is, then pardoning of the properties of pilgrim, pardoning of sin. So the complex and failed structuring of it. Prayer is more prevalent to save a nation than a sword. The book was the material covers more than 30 years. I think I've said the earliest sermon is by Thomas Taylor. The latest sermon is by a man called John Jackson, a rejected minister, patronised both by Boothby and his son-in-law, John Journeth. It's also, the material covers more than 30 years. And we could be all day discussing how it was compiled. But I think it must be written over a great many years too. Very hard to explain precisely how and why it was written. There is extensive cross-referencing to it. So that, for instance, which you can see, perhaps I don't know how well you can see on this, but one of the, I've said signs of saving grace and salvation is perhaps the theme that covers the largest space in the book. And one section of that includes extracts from a sermon, which itself includes 19 differences between civility and true purity, preached by Mr. Calamy in March 1643. And this covers 13 folio pages, which is a lot of words, because as you can see, his writing's thankfully very neat but fairly small. But the folio pages are in 3 different places. He starts on page 541. Then he goes to page 572 with a cross-reference back that the first 4 are in folio 541. 572 continues to 579. And then he goes up to 591 and finishes on 594. And at the end of 594, he reminds us that the first of these, the beginning of these signs, are in folio 541, all of them by Calamy in March 1643. That's the folio, that's the picture on the right. So he was writing this into a book where there was already other material, but there were blank spaces. And there are periods where he cross-references forward and then cross-references back and then cross-references forward again. He's not simply going through this book sequentially with the blank space always at the end. Sometimes he begins later on, runs out of space and goes back. Many of the sections on prayer do that. I won't bother you with the detail. It was begun, I think, probably in the late 1630s, the very early 1640s. Oh, let me just. The material done probably in the late 1630s, very early 1640s. The cover includes the note of the birth of his son George in October 1641, with a later unfinished note of his death. I then think, just because of the concentration of dates and space, it was probably worked on during the years of his eclipse from office in the late 1640s, 1650s, and again after 1662. The substantial table, I think, was almost certainly added after 1662, because the same inserted gathering of material includes also a long account of an illegal sermon by Thomas Watson from 1664. comparatively too little, comparatively, I can't believe he was too busy to go to sermons, but he was probably perhaps too busy for taking or organising his notes. And as the Congregational Library suggests, he did have extensive notes of some sermons from the 1640s. I think this book, as I say, is an extraordinary witness to Boothby's strenuous, enduring engagement with Puritan preaching. Much more elaborate, much more time-consuming than Harper's wide-ranging but much less complex notes. Boothby too must have had a library of sermons. He wrote them out and wrote them out again. He chopped them up into headings. He used marginal headings. He had running heads that he varied, and he, worked on these over. And then at the end, he added, an elaborate and complicated, and not very helpful, I'd have thought, index or table. And we know, of course, that there's a rare 1641 sermon, the day the deputy was beheaded. But it's, again, it's put in about that very timely mention is slightly at odds with a heading that it's about of fear. I don't know if it's fear of the Lord Deputy Wentworth being executed, or fear himself. Anyway, as we know, sermon note taking was perhaps not as common as Robert Bailey thought, but it was clearly widely going on, and it was clearly going on very energetically in Mary Aldermanbury. The references on this slide are all of manuscript notes taken by lay people, I think. University manuscript is anonymous. All the others are lay notes taken with Ptolemy and other preachers in Mary Aldermanbury. And there's another volume, at least one of the volumes so far, of notes of Ptolemy preaching in Mary Aldermanbury on a hypocrite, on hypocrisy, which is one of the themes Boothby's obsessed with in Sheffield University Library. So note-taking is common. What is interesting about Harper's and Boothby's notes is that they are very, very long. They're long witnesses. And I think it's very interesting that, as well as we know, Harper occasionally took notes from memory. People take short notes to take back the heads of sermons to discuss in their households. People make notes in the church as aids to memory, and perhaps to look out afterwards, but usually much shorter notes. They also have preaching sort of diaries where they go from church to church, taking what they can take on the rest. These notes are very extensive. We can't be certain, and certainly one of the Bodley and Rawlinson manuscript, which is of a sermon that Boothby also takes. It's much shorter. It's a much shorter record of it, but includes material that Boothby doesn't include. So we can never be sure they're complete. But people who are taking these long notes or acquiring these long notes, copying them out into their own notes, seem to me to be using them for the longue durée. They all include repetitions, recapitulations. On my last sermon, I did this, the asides. They're not just taking, if you like, the argument. They're not quite doing just the doctrines and uses. What I think they're doing is trying to recreate a sort of oral, sensual, emotional experience that you can then reflect on later on. And I've just got a couple of quotes. I mean, we know preaching is the normal means of salvation, bringing people to faith. But I think there are lots of images in sermons themselves about why you need to think about them over the long durée. And this was a nice quote from a printed sermon, a sort of economic motion. We must do as tradesmen do with the money they get. Use it at the time, but keep it up for later. Provision for old age or an evil day. That man is an unprofitable hearer of the word, who doth not stock and store himself with sermons. And that's clearly Boothby and Harper are stocking and storing themselves with sermons. And probably I do think Boothby often was concerned with the sort of enduring message rather than, I think Mary Morrissey makes this point as well, that they're not necessarily maybe the printed sermons that are the timely ones, the more ephemeral ones. If you're making all this effort to make notes, copy out notes, store your notes, etc., you're keeping them up for the future. And some nice quotes. The Boothby notebooks. The church is cordial, sort of a medical metaphor there for consolation, for advice, and so on. And the other, there's also from the William Jaggard on this slide is from the Harper manuscripts. Sees it in a very, perhaps a slightly grotesque image almost of health, that they work as physic if you ponder them, and meditation on a sermon is like chafing the body with a pomander to make the smell. And it's what you remember and how you labor on the long term for them. Calumny, a spiritual nosegay. The Bodleian title talks about orificial, sermons that will affect the senses, the hearing, and also the emotions. There's embodiment, there's emotional impact, there's sensual, an oral, sensual, and emotional experience, not simply an intellectual one. They're there for the longue durée, and they're there, say, the repetitions, the asides, the recapitulations, means that you can try and evoke that experience long after, ponder them for long after in your heart. So, and they're also, I mean, it's perhaps worth saying, I think it's implied in what I've said about them, they have very rarely any adversarial or any qualitative notions of hearers' judgments. Never say a good sermon or, that I didn't agree with it. They're there to just think about the later. It's also clear that for Boothby, they are more and more, I read that they are very intellectually demanding sermons, I think. They're on the fundamental issues of salvation within simply an experimental Calvinist framework. He's concerned particularly with soteriology, with salvation, how it was attained, and how you were assured you were one of God's elect saints, on whether you were justified by Christ's grace. Justification was the free gift of God, not due to any merit in man. Once elected, the elect could not finally and totally fall from grace. But Boothby's concerned with how you could know you were justified and how you could, how you should behave yourself in this world. There's nothing much, surprisingly, for someone who spent a fair amount of time petitioning about church government in the 1640s. There's nothing on church government in really in these sermons. It's also a man who never, as far as we can, never took notes on a sermon by an Episcopal conformist after 1662. There's not much really on worship. There's some on set prayer, there's some on Christmas. Both of those are okay in the 1630s, and they're not so okay by the 1640s and 1650s. They're much more about assurance, about the really complicated notion of how you can know the difference between a civil man and a true believer, the subjectivity, difficult subjectivity of how you might be a confident hypocrite or a weak, rather than a weak Christian. So I'm reaching the end, so I'll just do this very quickly. It's concerned very much with justification. It's very antinomian, because Taylor and Stoughton, very much leaders of the experimental Calvinist opposition to antinomians, and therefore he's very, very concerned with the subjective and probably problematic notion of sanctification. Anyone who's justified will be sanctified. They are the two twins that live and die together, and our sanctification is evidence of our justification, although there are obviously problems with that. They're not, Boothby seems to me to be intellectually explaining why you need to think about your own salvation. They're not concerned, if you like, with the practical ways in which you deal with the difficult paradoxes of predestinarian or theology, self-examination, constant watchfulness over a sinful heart. It's why you should do it. It may be he's avoiding the difficulties of it by intellectualizing them. I'm not sure. Anyway, what I'm just going to say very briefly that I'm not going to just write a book about technicalities of cross-referencing. I'm hoping to use Boothby's career to do some nuancing towards two very great books, but Boothby doesn't quite fit the old merchant, new merchant contrast in Brenner's Merchants and Revolution. And I think he adds a different perspective to how far Orthodox Calvinists can be radical activists in the Civil War. But I want to just end with a couple of words about resilience and defiance. There are some similarities, I think, obviously, between Harper and, in a very broad sense, between Harper and Boothby. I think you'd say they're both Calvinists, they're both experiential Calvinists, they're concerned with sanctification, they're fairly orthodox. But they act very differently in the Restoration. Harper goes to lots of high profile sermons. And then he hears Benjamin Needler's farewell sermon, and then he, without any particular sign of strain, he goes to Charles Burke's minister's first sermon as the intruded minister. He's very much based on his parish. He's very much basing, making the best of things, and church Puritan, who doesn't seem to have been worried about the Restoration, and he continues to hear Burke till he goes. Boothby, I think, as well as the sort of notion of sanctification, assurance, justification, and so on, Boothby has a very strong sense of being part of a godly community. I think that gave him his sense of responsibility and engagement with the world, and a very great sense of a profound division between the godly and the wicked. Those who persecute God, Mr. Watson, on the godly and the wicked, for example. The Lord bears a true, singular, and precious and everlasting love unto his people. Persecuting the saints are going to bring ruin to themselves. I think that underlay his activism and to some extent his optimism and his resilience at the Restoration. Calamy, who we might see as a moderate, but Calamy believed that even in the most difficult times, approaching ejection, it's already clear that Presbyterianism had failed. The world was hating towards an end when the godly would be brought back from the brink of ruin, and the wicked would be ultimately be defeated in God's providential judgments. And if we believed it, and I think Boothby did believe it, it would make us comfortably to rest upon God in times of danger. And Boothby, as I said, never heard or never recorded hearing a sermon by any minister who conformed after 1662. And in 1662, indeed, I think he was probably more radical than he'd ever been. He seems, I think, from his letters, that he was in touch in early 1663 with a notorious plotter, Robert Ferguson, who was had a very ambiguous relationship with the restored government, but was passing on information on Presbyterians and Congregationalists to the government in the end. But Boothby writes to a Mr. Ferguson in prison, who I think must be the notorious plotter Robert Ferguson. He writes to him in very emotional ways, in very encouraging ways, that the rod of the wicked will not ally on the back of the righteous. Babylon will fall, and we should comfort ourselves and not be weary in well-doing, for in due season we shall reap, if we faint not in his, not our own time. We be found faithful to the death, not to fall. So a brief conclusion would be that even within a sort of broadly Calvinist or moderate, particularly orthodox framework, one can see different trajectories, and that Boothby, for all the fact his life might be seen as a failure, in terms of his own trajectory, was confident at the Restoration that you should not compromise, and that ultimately, with the help of God, God's people would be vindicated. Thank you. I'll stop there. I'm sorry to have gone on a bit long. Phew.
Thank you so much for that fascinating talk. We do have some time for questions, so if anyone has some questions, I will keep a speakers list. I believe Mary Morrissey is the first hand I've seen.
I'm sorry, that was a bit too keen, wasn't it? Can you see me?
I can, yeah.
Sorry. Thank you very much. I mean, that was absolutely wonderful, and really, really rich material, and very thought-provoking, which is my excuse for asking a question that is still rather thinking through. But what you were saying about the difference between the sort of short sermon notes and then the fully written up version, and how he's rearranging them, and what the Boothby but also Harper, what they're doing with this material, it just made me wonder if perhaps it's a bit anachronistic of us to assume that the sermon continues to belong to the preacher. Is it possible that once they've heard the sermon and taken notes, that they then consider it theirs, if you like, and authorship becomes irrelevant? It stops becoming a performance or a text, and it becomes a spiritual resource that is theirs.
I think it clearly is used as a spiritual resource. It's certainly used by Boothby, which is why the letters are also really interesting, because the letters include a sort of 20,000 word letter to his children, where he's deploying, it starts with Adam and Eve, it's a sort of very extended sort of advice. I think though he still sees it, and there's also these things where he writes to his sister-in-law about stage plays and says, you know, let me put you in mind of this sermon of Mr. Calamy that we both heard, with the end be, you know, 9 reasons. So I don't think it's an either or, but I certainly think that they're a storehouse for the Calamy term. They're a sort of cordial to remind yourself of, and I do think they're clearly being used in that way. I think it's also, I mean, there's well, what the kind of, they're Hartops. One of the ones who's also taking sermons of Calamy is the people who take lots of sermons by John Owen. It's another Dr. Williams or Congregational Library manuscript, which are then published as Owen's sermons, I think 100 years later. So they become, I do think they are certainly their stuff for various reasons. Yeah, I think it's, but I think they are, the long notes seem to me to be ways of almost recreating in your mind that because certainly the Congregational Library of the Calamy sermons are a series. So the first part of the sermon is a recapitulation of the last one. Now, if I was writing that out, you know, if you're taking notes at a lecture, you wouldn't bother, would you? It's sort of, you know, I came last week, so I'm not going to do it again. But there's something that you want to have it as an experience that is presumably what you think is the most crucial aspects of that experience. So, but I think it's symbiotic. But I think, yeah, I think it's his book. You know, it might be a lot of Calamy's or his versions of Calamy's words, or Taylor's words, but it's his book, Walter Boothby, his book, number 2, whichever number 1 is.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have some other questions or comments?
Anne.
Oh, Alan.
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Hi, Alan.
Yeah, thank you. Hello, Anne. Thank you very much for an interesting talk. I just wonder, as somebody who occasionally preaches himself, is there, in any sense, in what you've read, an awareness of the preacher's interaction with the people in front of him? It's not just a prepared sermon which he delivers, but somehow there's an interaction between the highborn, the lowborn, the men, the women. Does it differ, as it were, who's in front of him? Is there any sense that you can take up of what's going on between them, the interaction? It's, after all, a bit of a performance.
I think that's a really interesting question. I think it's very hard to be sure about. There's no overt mention of it. It's not like one of these sermon accounts where, you know, thumping the table or weeping or engaging. There are these things, you know, beloveds and all that sort of thing. And I think that's, and I do think it's a problem about how, whether, I mean, clearly ministers like lists and lay people like lists and things like that. I do think whether there's note-taking techniques and how they, I think it's an unanswered question, or an unanswerable question. Although it's one that's very fruitful to think about, which doesn't, about how far you can capture the sort of emotional engagement. Obviously there is an engagement, and he is obviously close to Calamy, and Harper is clearly close to Culverwell, but it's not clear to me how, there's no direct evidence, I suppose, and deduced from you know, it's very hard to know.
And
It's also
yet,
hard to know sort of incoherence, which might be emotional by the preacher, you know, whether that's just people taking, you know, the notes I've taken. I've done a lot of work on the Gell family, which I noticed Danielle Clark's here.
yes.
You know, there's sermons, daughter's taking of the mother dying, or not mother dying, but, you know, funeral sermon for the mother, and which are very scrappy and emotional. But, you know, the preacher preaching was close to her mother, you know, so who's being the emotion in a sermon like that, where that's coming from, is not easy to see. But thank you for the question.
Well, you know, Anne, that you would not preach the same sermon to the rich burghers of Cheapside in St Mary Aldermanbury as you might preach to some peasants out in Buckinghamshire or wherever, with respect to
I'm not. Yes, no, I guess that's true. Although I'm not sure. Yeah, well, you wouldn't. But I think what's interesting to me is there's no evidence that Boothby's been. There's no evidence. Neither Boothby nor Harper went to university, as far as I can tell. Harper's quite well. They're both quite common names. They presumably went to grammar school. So I haven't found the record for a plausible record for Boothby. There are plausible records for Harper. But I think one thing which I should perhaps have said, I do think it's quite remarkable that we assume that this sort of divinity is forbidding, but these are not these are not intellectuals, or you know, but they can engage with, you know, strenuously difficult religious theological issues, it seems to me. And peasants of, you know, wherever might as well. I don't know. They worked it. Anyway, thank you.
We do have a comment from Danielle Clark about many of the same methods turning up in women's sermon notes. I don't know if that's something you would want to address, Anne, whether there are differences in these notes that you might not find in notes by women.
I mean, the sermon notes, I don't know, I'm thinking of Kate Narvison's notion about the sermon notes. Well, Catherine Gell and John Gell seem to me to make different sermon notes. Again, they often take notes of the same sermon. I don't, Daniel may not agree, but that there is the lack of a grammar school education may affect women's sermon notes, it seems to me. But I don't think it affects their intellectual capacity to understand, you know, Calvinist divinity. Clearly didn't. And I think the notion that you keep quite long notes to, you know, if that was the point, to recreate the experience, I think is very interesting.
Are there any other questions, comments? I think Mary has.
Sorry, if I can just again, I'm wondering if the really important distinction there is really about between the clerics and the lay, and again about languages. I mean, we think lay people went to act sermons, and so they might be taking notes in Latin. They may be including Latin translations in sermon notes and so on. And certainly one of the things I look for in sermon notes when trying to decide if it's a preacher or a hearer's notes is whether or not there's Greek, and presumably that the laity, particularly those who have who are literate in English but not literate in Latin, there would be more similarities between men and women. They can access difficult theology as long as it's not in Latin.
Yeah, I guess that's so. Yeah. I think it's interesting because I forgot to say it on my many of John Stoughton's sermons were printed after his death, and the prefaces I'm interested, because bookseller I'm interested in, printed some of them. The prefaces do explain that's whether they're that he left sort of manuscripts or whether they're here as manuscripts, and whether I don't know why I said that, but that it's answering your last question more than that comment, but that laity, how often, be interesting to know how often London preachers, during the 40s and 50s at least, preached in, whether they did much Latin. They do, but they do, you're right, they do elucidate the Greek and translation. Yeah. I wonder about the GEMMS, whether GEMMS as a project, whether you think you privilege preachers over lay people. I don't, clearly it's very, very rich resource for both lay people and preachers, but I wonder about, whether because it's sermons, it starts with the preachers rather than the lay people.
Yeah, it's an interesting question that I was thinking about as you were talking. I think part of the problem is with a lot of the hearers, we don't actually know who they were.
Yeah.
And that can be a bit of a challenge as well, especially or subjects of funeral sermons, for instance. So it's sometimes harder to identify the lay people because we don't have the same kind of resources that we
sure. Yeah.
Any other questions or comments before we wrap up?
Yeah.
Okay, then I will turn things back over.
Oh, this is Jennifer. This is Jennifer.
I didn't actually have a question, but sorry, my voice is difficult. I just wanted to say, in GEMMS, I mean, it is possible to access it either from
the
preacher's perspectives or the note takers, if you have some idea who they are.
Yeah.
And of course, we also have, you can look at it in a manuscript record to see, the whole picture.
Yeah.
So there is some flexibility there. Of course, we often don't know as much about the note takers, as Anne said. Though some of the preachers we don't know very much about either.
I think I sometimes think if I saw John Donne's sermon, I wouldn't be interested. I think as I had a joke, if I saw Walter, I don't think Walter would be good. It's quite it's interesting if it depends what you're looking for, doesn't it? And and you can certainly, get to learn an awful lot from it. GEMMS is fantastic. I think it's and we'd like to, it gives us a lot to work, wonderful things to work with. And if you couldn't do the sort of detail that you can do with a few manuscripts, you wouldn't have the 25,000 sermons for us, would you? If you had to, work out who every note taker was and what, where they came from. No, I think it's right. How we doing?
Were there any further questions?
I did.
Oh yeah, Pete.
Yeah. Well, two. They're not really questions, but two things. One is, I mean, in the life of John Bruin, he says it's, you know, he doesn't say, his biographer says he kept, you know, he was an assiduous sermon goer. He went miles to exercises. He took huge amounts of sermon notes. His study was lined with the sermon notes. They're lost, isn't it a shame? But
Oh God, right.
In that life, it's used to legitimate Bruin's activities as an expositor of scripture, because it's clear in life that Bruin basically preaches to his own household.
Right.
And the claim is he did it on the basis of ministerial templates, which makes it all right then, doesn't it? Now, I can see there's a huge difference between, you know, popish-ridden Cheshire and the turn of the 16th century and London in the 1640s.
Yeah.
But I was wondering if there's any evidence that some of these notes are used for that purpose, or that they're the basis for the repetition of sermons by Boothby in his own household. I mean, it's a different sort of lay activism.
Yeah.
There isn't any evidence.
There's no evidence of that, but what there is evidence, and it may be the letters. You see, he has this poor unsatisfactory son that he sends to Barbados, I think probably to his death, because he won't behave himself. And he's got a brother-in-law that he falls out with, well, the whole family falls out with. And so he does this epistolary counselling. It's, you know, what is it still called? But so there's which is based on the sermon, or even sister-in-law, when she's not at the theatre, she loses a necklace or something, or perhaps she loses it and finds it again. So there's this letter on, you know, providence and what Mr. Calamy might have thought about it. So he's doing it in writing. He never says and he must be doing it. I mean, they say there's a whole massive long letter. He does a sort of Wallington. I think he's a sort of slightly better educated Wallington. Perhaps doesn't like speaking to people.
Yes.
But likes writing them, you know, very elaborate letters, which are clearly deploying the sermon notes.
The sermons, yeah. And the other question was, I mean, there's a sense in which these people are doing what the ministers want them to do, right? So when I'm not saying they're just going according to a clerical script, but the ministers are always on about a sermon has to be applied to the experience of the individual. You have to take it away. You have to think about it. You have to repeat it. You have to you know, apply it. Think, you know, use it. And Samuel Ward's got this great image for the difference between a printed sermon and a preached sermon. He says a preached sermon is like the rain, and it soaks the soil, but it goes away. The snow stays longer and will remain with you for longer, and therefore it does a different job. And what struck me was that the sermon notes are almost mediating between Ward's version of what word preached does and the printed word does, the printed sermon. So
the printed
like
sermon is snow.
You take it away.
I mean, yes, I think it is interesting. It's also interesting if you think about it from the preacher's point, because I think if you start with the printed sermons, and certainly if you start with something like the fast sermons, you think they're churning them out, sending to the press, and yet none of these Calamy sermons, as far as I can see, are printed. The printed oeuvre of these famous preachers at the height of, you know, pamphlet sermons, you know, it's a tiny proportion of what they're doing, and they're so it is the people listening and meditating on the word as preached is where they're having, well, who knows what impact they had. I think but I do think Boothby is intellectually engaging with problems of Calvinism.
Yeah.
I mean, he obviously is doing, but behave. I mean, he's a sort of poster boy for it, perhaps, but you know, so he's not going home and behave. You know, it's not so much about behavior even as why why I have to behave. I think it is the difference between the civil Christian and the true Christian, or hypocrisy. A true weak Christian, but a smooth civil man. It's sort of, so obviously it is about behavior and sanctification, but it's almost about the intellectual framework for that, it seems to me.
Yeah, the difference between the hypocrite or an outward Christian and a proper one is that the outward Christian just does the practice, almost routinized performance of what you're supposed to do, and the real Christian thinks about it and knows why he's doing it or she's doing it, and thinks about it all the time. And there's a sense in which, on the one hand, while the sermons are about you have to go and pray once or twice a day, you do these things, they're very clear that on its own is no good at all. You've got to do other stuff. And so in that sense, that distinction between thinking about it and feeling it, I mean, I know why you're making it, but it's almost like that's the distinction. These things are supposed to break down.
Anyway,
sorry, I'll shut up. I'm going on.
No, that's very helpful. I suppose it comes from a sense that we privilege a certain more, or not familiar, but a more, you'd like to have a nice diary, whereas I'm feeling a bit miserable today. I would, made some money today. It's cheered me up. I think it may be a sort of privileging of introspection in a more modern way.
Sorry, I know I talk too much. Again. A fact that I think is always worth remembering is just the time it takes to do these things. Dunn says that it takes him 8 hours to write out a sermon. Sorry, my light's gone off. So the full text of these things, it was a very considerable physical effort to create the copy of the sermon. And I think the writing it itself is an effort. It is, a devotional practice, just making the copy. And one of the reasons why Calamy may only be printing a fraction of the sermons that he preaches is he just doesn't have the time. We know that a lot of Dunn's sermons were written out in full by Dunn when he was ill. Or when he was recovering from illness, he took the time to write them out because he thought they might be useful or valuable, possibly to his son. So it was an extra job to do this. And he reckoned 8 hours a sermon, and that's a very good kind of rough reckoner for these things. So whether it's Boothby writing it out as a kind of a devotional practice, or Calamy producing copy for a printer, it's a day's work.
I think it must, and I think I say they did it. They must be doing it and redoing it, and they're making, and Harper just doing the table and then putting the page numbers. These are the different sermons on the creed, and all the different sermons on the the monthly exercise. No, I think being able to say they spent a lot of time and effort and thinking and organizing is and also those of us who aren't young think writing stuff out, because I'm alarmed. People apparently now, you don't need to transcribe, you can train the computer to transcribe documents, and you just think, well, and then you think, God, I've spent 3 months writing those out, but what an idiot. But then you do think, well, would I have anything up somehow in my mind if I just trained the computer to recognize? You probably could recognize Boothby's hand is pretty clear if you trained it up, but I don't. It's how that will make a difference to how we approach our text, I don't know. Nice to see. So I've belatedly worked out how I can see more than one person at a time. Elliot's going to say something. Go on, unmute yourself, Elliot.
Don't know if it's going to. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, my radiator has blown all my electricity. It's the first time I've turned it on. It's just
Oh my goodness. I turned my heating on today.
Do you see any distinction in the way sermons are notated after 1662? Because obviously they're in taverns and places, aren't they? And they're in back rooms as sitting in church in Aldermanbury.
Yeah, I don't know, because the Thomas Watson sermon that he has, there's to be fair, and it affects my conclusion. I decided to have an optimistic conclusion. There are only about 3. So I'm not sure, and they're like, but the Watson sermon is a very long account. And I don't know, but I think Watson perhaps had a chapel in London. It's 1663 or 64. I'm not sure if it was in a tavern. It was a quiet, hushed tavern, I think, that was it is. But that's an interesting point. I mean, then I think, he doesn't die till 69, but they're not. I think he's not. I'm trying to think if it's true of all of them, which would be interesting. The Watson sermon is just done, and I think the John Jackson sermon as well it's done in different pages of the book, but I think it's not chopped up or used for different purposes. And it may be that the substantial sort of, I don't think it is commonplacing, whatever we call it, is done in the 50s, and then the more are written out. But they're not short sermons, certainly. They're complicated, and I think they're not. Well, they don't say anything about being illegal or underground or anything like that. But you perhaps wouldn't say that. That's a very interesting question.
I think thank you so much, Anne.
I was just going to say to Elliot, I often say, because very occasionally Elliot has asked me, what did Calamy say in this book? And I've, said I've sent him a reference to Calamy. So Elliot and I have sometimes read the same manuscripts, but for different purposes. We should do a double act one day. This is Calamy's sermon. I know this is, Walter Boothby's record of what might have been Calamy's sermon.
Well, the interesting thing, of course, is Calamy has, he's a hypothetical universalist, which I wonder if when he's preaching, whether, I've often wondered if people take, like somebody like Boothby will take Calamy's hypothetical universalism different from a much more sort of, superlapsarian, like say Watson. I assume Watson's that way, but I assume that those.
I think Boothby thinks. Yeah, I think Boothby's pretty sure he's saved. I don't know, one way or the other, probably. But I think that is, the community. He might not think he's a good person, but he thinks somehow I'm part of the community of the godly. I think that's what keeps you cheerful. If there was, yeah, we should stop, shouldn't we?
Yeah, it would be at this point that I wish I could say we could continue this over coffee or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
But these things always sort of end abruptly. But thank you so much, Anne. It was just fascinating. Obviously, so much to discuss here. I should just briefly apologize. There were a few people who had trouble getting in, and I didn't see the messages very quickly because I was too absorbed in listening to Anne. But we have recorded all of this, and the recording should be available next week, and anyone who is here will receive links to that, and it'll be on our YouTube channel. And I also just wanted to put in a little mention of next month. We're having Hannah Yip, who's one of the GEMMS researchers, who will be speaking about sermons by the unordained, and that's on November 21st at the same time as this lecture was. And so thank you all for coming. and for Anne for the wonderful lecture. And we hope to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.